Welcome, friends, to the heartwarming story of an elderly woman whose act of kindness changed the lives of a young mother and her daughter forever. Enjoy the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of Margaret Wilson's farmhouse. At 73, Margaret stood in the doorway, her arthritis-gnarled hands clutching a worn leather suitcase. Her faded blue eyes, still sharp despite the years, took in every detail of the only home she'd known for the past 5 decades. The peeling white paint, the creaky floorboards, the ancient rocking chair where she'd spent countless evenings watching the sunset. Each sight sent a pang through her heart. But Social Security checks only stretched so far, and the nursing home was waiting. "Well, old girl," Margaret muttered to herself, her voice quavering, "I reckon it's time." She stepped onto the porch, wincing as her hip protested the movement. The key trembled in her hand as she locked the door for the last time. For a moment she stood there, paralyzed by the finality of it all. Then, with a deep breath, Margaret bent down slowly and placed the key under an old tin can on the porch steps. It was a habit from simpler times, when neighbors looked out for each other, and locked doors were more suggestion than necessity. "Someone might need it more than me," she whispered, a tear slipping down her wrinkled cheek. Straightening up with effort, Margaret grasped her walking stick and began the slow journey down the gravel driveway. Each step felt like a goodbye, to the towering oak tree she'd climbed as a girl, to the flower beds she'd tended with loving care, to the memories of a life well lived. As she reached the end of the driveway, Margaret turned for one last look. The morning light bathed the old farmhouse in a golden glow, as if nature itself was bidding her farewell. "Goodbye, old friend," she murmured. "Thanks for the memories." With that, Margaret Wilson squared her shoulders and set off down the dusty country road, her walking stick tapping out a steady rhythm on the asphalt. The sun climbed higher in the sky as Margaret made her way to the bus stop. It was only a mile from her home, but to her aching joints, it might as well have been a marathon. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her breath came in short gasps. "Lord, have mercy," she panted, leaning heavily on her walking stick. "I'm not as spry as I used to be." As she approached the familiar green bench that served as the local bus stop, Margaret's eyes widened in dismay. The bench was occupied by 3 teenage boys, their baggy jeans and backward caps a stark contrast to her floral dress and sensible shoes. For a moment, Margaret hesitated. In her day, young people respected their elders, but times had changed, and she wasn't sure what to expect. Gathering her courage, Margaret approached the bench. "Excuse me, boys," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "I don't suppose you'd mind if an old lady rested her feet for a spell?" To her surprise, the boys immediately sprang up. "No problem, ma'am," said the tallest one, gesturing to the bench. "Please, have a seat." "Yeah, we were just leaving anyway," added another, nudging his friends. As Margaret sank gratefully onto the bench, the third boy asked, "You waiting for the bus to town, ma'am?" Margaret nodded, touched by their unexpected kindness. "Yes, I am. Thank you kindly." The boys exchanged glances, then the tall one spoke up again. "Mind if we wait with you? Make sure you get on okay?" Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. For the next 20 minutes, Margaret found herself regaling the boys with stories from her youth, tales of sock hops and drive-in movies, of her late husband Jack, and the day he proposed right there on her daddy's front porch. When the bus finally rumbled into view, the boys helped Margaret to her feet and assisted her with her bag. "You take care now, Mrs. Wilson," said the tall boy as she climbed the steps. "Yeah, and don't forget to kick some butt at bingo," called another, earning a chuckle from Margaret. As the bus pulled away, Margaret waved at the boys through the window. Her heart felt a little lighter, buoyed by this unexpected encounter. Maybe, she thought, there was still some good left in this changing world after all. The bus lurched and swayed as it made its way down the winding country roads towards the city. Margaret sat near the front, her bag clutched tightly in her lap, her walking stick propped against the seat beside her. As fields gave way to suburbs and then to towering buildings, Margaret felt increasingly out of place. The city had always made her nervous. Too many people, too much noise, too little of the simple kindness she'd known all her life. You all right there, ma'am? The bus driver's gruff voice startled her from her reverie. Margaret managed a weak smile. Oh, yes, just taking it all in. The driver nodded sympathetically. First time in the big city? No, Margaret sighed. But it might as well be. Everything's changed so much. As the bus approached the station, Margaret steeled herself for the challenge ahead. Getting off the bus would be harder than getting on, especially with her bag and walking stick. To her surprise, a young woman in a business suit stood up as the bus slowed. Here, she said, holding out her hand. Let me help you. With the woman's assistance, Margaret made it down the steps safely. She turned to thank her helper, but the woman had already disappeared into the crowd. Standing on the busy sidewalk, Margaret felt overwhelmed. The nursing home had arranged for someone to meet her, but in this sea of unfamiliar faces, how would she ever find them? Just then, a voice called out, Mrs. Wilson? Margaret Wilson? Margaret turned to see a kind-faced woman in scrubs waving at her. Relief washed over her as she waved back. That's me, she called. I'm Margaret Wilson. As the woman approached, Margaret took a deep breath. This was it, the moment her old life truly ended and her new one began. With a silent prayer for strength, she stepped forward to meet her future. The bus station bustled with activity as Margaret followed the nurse, whose name tag read Sarah, through the crowded terminal. The noise and commotion were overwhelming, and Margaret found herself longing for the quiet of her farmhouse. We'll just get you checked in at the home, Mrs. Wilson, Sarah was saying. Then we can get you settled in your new room. Margaret nodded absently, her attention caught by a young woman and a little girl huddled in a corner. The woman's face was streaked with tears, while the child clung to her, wide-eyed and frightened. Oh my, Margaret murmured. Sarah, do you see those two over there? They look like they could use some help. Sarah glanced over, her expression sympathetic but resigned. I'm sure someone will assist them, Mrs. Wilson. We really should be going. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to do something. I'm sorry, dear, but I just can't leave without checking on them. It'll only take a moment. Before Sarah could protest, Margaret was already making her way towards the pair, her walking stick tapping out a determined rhythm on the tile floor. Excuse me? Margaret said gently as she approached. I couldn't help but notice you seem to be in some distress. Is there anything I can do to help? The young woman looked up, startled. Oh, no, we're fine, she said quickly, wiping at her eyes. Just waiting for our bus. But the little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. Mommy, I'm hungry, she whispered. Margaret's heart clenched. Without hesitation, she opened her bag and pulled out the lunch she'd packed for her journey. Homemade chicken salad sandwiches, a thermos of sweet tea, and her famous oatmeal cookies. Here, she said, holding out the food. Please take this, I insist. The woman hesitated, but the hunger in her daughter's eyes won out. Thank you, she said softly, accepting the offering. You're very kind. As the little girl bit into a sandwich, Margaret lowered herself onto a nearby bench. I'm Margaret, she said. And who might you two be? I'm Emily, the little girl piped up between bites. And this is my mom, Irene. Irene managed a small smile. It's nice to meet you, Margaret, and thank you again for the food. Think nothing of it, dear, Margaret said warmly. Now why don't you tell me what's troubling you? Sometimes it helps to talk things out with a friendly ear. For a moment, Irene looked ready to refuse, but then, as if a dam had broken, the words came pouring out. She told Margaret about her husband, Andrew, who had taken a job in another city, about the mother-in-law who had made their lives miserable, constantly criticizing and interfering, about the fight that had led to this desperate escape attempt. I just couldn't take it anymore, Irene finished, her voice barely above a whisper. But now I don't know where we're going to go. Margaret listened intently, her heart aching for this young family. As Irene's story came to an end, an idea began to form in Margaret's mind. It was crazy, perhaps even foolish, but somehow it felt right. Irene, she said slowly, what would you say if I told you I might have a solution to your problem? Irene looked at her skeptically. What do you mean? Margaret took a deep breath. Well, you see, I have this house. Margaret's words hung in the air as Irene and Emily stared at her, their eyes wide with disbelief. "A house?" Irene repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand." Margaret smiled gently, patting Irene's hand. "My dear, I was on my way to a nursing home because I could no longer manage my farmhouse on my own. But listening to your story, well, it seems to me that house could be put to much better use with a young family living in it." Emily's eyes lit up. "A farm? With animals and everything?" "Now hold on," Irene interjected, shaking her head. "Margaret, that's incredibly generous, but we couldn't possibly—" "Nonsense," Margaret cut her off firmly. "I may be old, but I'm not addled. I know exactly what I'm offering." She leaned in, her voice softening. "Irene, that house has been in my family for generations. The thought of it sitting empty, gathering dust, it breaks my heart. But you and Emily, you could bring it back to life." Tears welled up in Irene's eyes. "But what about you? Where will you go?" Margaret waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, I'll be fine at the nursing home. It's time I had some help, truth be told. But you two, you need a fresh start." Just then, Sarah the nurse approached, looking concerned. "Mrs. Wilson, we really need to get going." Margaret nodded, then turned back to Irene. "What do you say, dear? Will you at least come look at the place?" Irene hesitated, torn between hope and disbelief. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll look." The journey back to Margaret's farmhouse was filled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Sarah, after some persuasion and a call to her supervisor, agreed to drive them all in the nursing home's van. As they pulled up the gravel driveway, Irene gasped. The old farmhouse, bathed in the warm afternoon light, looked like something out of a storybook. "Oh, Margaret," she breathed. "It's beautiful." Emily was already bouncing in her seat. "Can we go see inside, Mommy? Please?" They all climbed out of the van, Margaret moving slowly with her walking stick. As they approached the porch, she bent down with some difficulty and retrieved the key from under the tin can. "Welcome home," she said softly, unlocking the door. The interior was modest but charming, filled with well-worn furniture and mementos of a life well lived. Irene ran her hand along the kitchen counter, taking in the cheerful yellow curtains and the view of the sprawling backyard. "I can't believe this," she murmured. "It's like a dream." Margaret watched them explore with a bittersweet smile. "Now, I know it needs some fixing up," she said. "But with a little love and care, it could be a wonderful home for you both." Irene turned to her, tears streaming down her face. "Margaret, I don't know how to thank you. It's too much." "Nonsense," Margaret replied firmly. "All I ask is that you love this place as much as I have. And," she added with a twinkle in her eye, "that you let me visit now and then." Emily threw her arms around Margaret's waist. "You can visit any time," she declared. "Right, Mommy?" Irene nodded, wiping her eyes. "Of course. Margaret, you'll always be welcome here." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Margaret knew it was time to go. She handed Irene a folder containing the deed and other important papers. "I had my lawyer draw these up a while back," she explained, "just in case something like this happened." With final hugs and promises to stay in touch, Margaret climbed back into the van with Sarah. As they drove away, she watched Irene and Emily waving from the porch, her porch, until they disappeared from view. The Sunshine Valley retirement home was a far cry from Margaret's beloved farmhouse. The sterile hallways and institutional decor made her heart ache for the warmth and character of her old home. But as Sarah showed her to her new room, Margaret squared her shoulders. She had made her choice, and she was determined to make the best of it. "Here we are, Mrs. Wilson," Sarah said, opening the door to reveal a small but tidy room with 2 beds. "You'll be sharing with Mrs. Ellen Thompson. She's a lovely lady. I'm sure you'll get along fine." Margaret nodded, taking in the sparse furnishings and the lone window overlooking a small courtyard. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As she unpacked her few belongings, the door opened, and a woman in a wheelchair rolled in. She had a kind face framed by silver hair, and despite her obvious physical limitations, there was a sparkle in her eyes. "Well, hello there," she said cheerfully. "You must be my new roommate. I'm Ellen." Margaret smiled, extending her hand. Margaret Wilson. It's nice to meet you, Ellen. As they chatted, Margaret learned that Ellen had lost the use of her legs in a car accident years ago. But rather than bitter, she seemed determined to find joy in every day. Life's too short to wallow in self-pity, Ellen declared. Now, how about we liven up this room a bit? I've got some lovely floral prints we could hang up. Over the next few days, Margaret settled into her new routine. She attended exercise classes, modified for her arthritis, joined a book club, and even tried her hand at watercolor painting. But every night, as she lay in her narrow bed, her thoughts drifted back to Irene and Emily, wondering how they were faring in her old home. A week after her arrival, Margaret received her first letter. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope, revealing a childish drawing of a house with 3 stick figures in front. One tall, one medium, and one small with wild curly hair. Tucked inside was a note from Irene. Dear Margaret, I hope this letter finds you well. We wanted to let you know that we're settling in nicely. Emily loves exploring the backyard, and I've already started planning a vegetable garden for next spring. The house feels more like home every day, thanks to your incredible generosity. We miss you and would love for you to visit soon. Emily asks about her Grandma Margaret every day. You've given us so much more than just a house. You've given us hope and a chance at a new life. With all our love, Irene and Emily. Tears blurred Margaret's vision as she read the letter again and again. She may have given up her home, but in return, she had gained something far more precious, a family. Weeks turned into months, and Margaret found herself adapting to life at Sunshine Valley. She and Ellen had become fast friends, their room transformed into a cozy haven with plants, photographs, and Ellen's artwork adorning the walls. One crisp autumn morning, as Margaret sat in the common room working on a jigsaw puzzle, she heard a commotion in the hallway. Curious, she looked up to see a crowd gathering near the entrance. What on earth? She muttered, setting aside her puzzle piece and reaching for her walking stick. As she made her way towards the crowd, she heard a familiar voice that made her heart skip a beat. We're looking for Margaret Wilson. Can someone please tell us where to find her? Margaret pushed through the throng of residents and staff, her eyes widening as she took in the sight before her. There, standing in the middle of the Sunshine Valley lobby, were Irene and Emily, accompanied by a tall, handsome man Margaret didn't recognize. Grandma Margaret, Emily squealed, breaking free from her mother's grasp and running towards her. Margaret opened her arms, enveloping the little girl in a warm embrace. Emily, my dear, what a wonderful surprise! Irene approached, her eyes shining with tears. Margaret, I hope you don't mind us dropping in like this. We have some news we wanted to share in person. It was then that Margaret noticed the matching gold bands on Irene and the unknown man's fingers. Her heart swelled with joy as she put the pieces together. And who might this gentleman be? She asked, a knowing smile playing at her lips. The man stepped forward, extending his hand. I'm Andrew, ma'am, Irene's husband, and I can't thank you enough for what you've done for my family. Margaret clasped his hand warmly. It's wonderful to meet you, Andrew. I've heard so much about you. As they made their way to a quiet corner of the common room, Irene explained how Andrew had tracked them down, how they had reconciled, and how they were now living happily in Margaret's old farmhouse. We've been fixing it up, Andrew said proudly. Repainted the whole exterior, fixed that leaky roof. It's looking better than ever. Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. I'm so glad, she whispered. That old place deserves a family to love it. Emily tugged at Margaret's sleeve. And guess what, Grandma Margaret? We're going to have a baby. I'm going to be a big sister. Margaret's eyes widened in delight. Oh my! Congratulations, all of you. This calls for a celebration. As if on cue, Ellen rolled up, balancing a tray of cookies and lemonade on her lap. I thought our guests might like some refreshments, she said with a wink. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of laughter, stories, and plans for the future. Margaret's heart felt fuller than it had in years, surrounded by this makeshift family she had somehow acquired. As the visit drew to a close, Andrew cleared his throat. Margaret, we have one more thing to discuss with you. We've been talking and, well, we'd like you to come live with us. Margaret blinked in surprise. Live with you? But I couldn't possibly. Please, Margaret, Irene interjected. You gave us a home when we had nothing. Now let us return the favor. We've already set up a room for you, right next to the nursery. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as she looked around at the eager faces surrounding her. She thought of the farmhouse she had loved for so long, of the family she had unexpectedly gained, of the chance to be part of a child's life again. With a trembling smile, Margaret nodded. Well, she said softly, I suppose it's time for this old bird to fly back to her nest. As they made plans for Margaret's homecoming, she couldn't help but marvel at the twists and turns life had taken. She had thought she was saying goodbye to her old life, but instead, she had found a new beginning, one filled with love, laughter, and the promise of tomorrow. And as she hugged Emily goodbye, promising to see her soon, Margaret knew that the best chapters of her story were yet to be written.
All right, everyone's presentations are done. Nick, the manager, said as he tried to move the discussion forward. Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something. Nick interrupted me and began to speak. There's apparently someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. His lackey, Mike, of course, agreed with Nick. I'm leaving. After leaving the meeting room, I started to shut down my computer. I noticed that an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking, there's no point in speaking up, no one will listen, I went home quietly. The next day, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. He was staring at his computer screen, his face pale. Nick! Is something wrong? Mike looked at the screen with him. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Knowing the reason for Mike's distress, I thought to myself, serves them right. My name is Adam. My mother passed away when I was in the 9th grade, and I was raised by my father. Well, you could hardly call it being raised. After my mother passed, my father changed. He drowned his sorrows in alcohol, and though he still went to work, he squandered our living expenses on horse racing. Because of that, I had to start working part-time as soon as I entered high school. Every month, I went to the convenience store with bills in hand that couldn't be auto-deducted from my father's account. Even though I endured it because I didn't want to be alone, I reached my limit in my second year of high school and dropped out. I found a live-in job at a distant inn. Thank you for everything. The day I left home, my father, still staring at the TV, spoke. Take care. That was our last conversation. Back then, 18 wasn't the age of majority, so I needed my father's permission to work, and I couldn't hide my place of employment. Yet, my father never visited me even once. I kept working just to survive, and before I knew it, I was 42. Years of hard work paid off, and I was transferred to the headquarters. I was thrilled to be recognized by the company, as I thought I'd be working in the field until retirement due to my lack of formal education. Listen up. Our work can change the future of our employees. Don't drag us down. On my first day after the transfer, Nick, dressed in an expensive suit, spoke sternly. There was a reason for this. Our inn was located in a prominent tourist destination, known so well that everyone in the state could sing its commercial jingle. At its peak, we had 5 locations within the state. But that was long ago. Due to financial difficulties and aging facilities, only the place where I had worked for many years and the original establishment remained. I was prepared to lose my job anytime, but now there was a glimmer of hope. With the rise of social media, the tourist area where the inn was located started gaining attention again. Depending on how hard the sales department, where I was transferred, worked, we could either thrive or be forced to give up this prime location to the new hotel chains continuously popping up. For Nick, who had switched careers from another industry to strengthen our sales, this was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. I understood why he had to be strict. I will do my best. Nick sneered at my enthusiastic declaration. Did you not hear what I said? I'm sorry. I thought I was listening carefully. Out of habit from years of customer service, I apologized reflexively, though I had no idea what had offended him. Someone was watching me with a smirk. In this department, there are those who are expected to excel and those who have been shoved here because they have nowhere else to go. You are the latter. It was Mike, the section chief. He's 7 years younger, at 35. But he was called to headquarters much earlier than I was and had been moving around within the headquarters ever since. I'm not jealous, but I can't accept that he's my boss. Graduating from a prestigious university, he has an unusually high pride and caused many problems as a newbie, making things very difficult for me when I was the front desk leader. When I found out Mike was transferred to the sales department a month before me, I was disheartened. Mike is right. With just a middle school diploma, there's not much you can do. Don't even think about achieving results. As if I didn't exist, Nick remarked, I'm thirsty. Mike eagerly ran to the coffee maker. It seems Mike is Nick's lackey. I regretted being happy about my transfer to headquarters, wishing I had stayed on site forever. Send a direct mail to every company on this list by the end of the day. Nick only assigned me tasks that even a new graduate could handle. What? There are over 1,000 companies. You want me to send to all of them by today? Yes, if you and your fellow misfits split the work, even those with nowhere else to go should finish by today. I glanced at the employees typing away expressionlessly. They were worn out from customer service, only thinking about leaving on time, or were women reassigned after having children, with zero motivation for work. Even Sam, a new graduate from the same university as Mike, who was supposed to be among the expected achievers, had no enthusiasm for the job, having joined the company wanting to do customer service. I don't care what they say, I plan to quit anytime, he said. Only Nick and Mike were highly motivated, making all the decisions between the two of them. I originally only wanted to work at the inn to survive and had no particular attachment to this job. I swallowed my words, thinking I had no right to reprimand them. About a month after the transfer, Nick told us with a frustrated look. To commemorate the 50th anniversary, we've decided to create a plan exclusive for one group per day. Originally, Mike and I were supposed to come up with it, but our president, Mr. Thompson, insists on hearing everyone's opinions. So, you all get a chance. As Nick explained, Mike began handing out prints. Make sure not to embarrass Nick. If your ideas are half-baked, you'll have to redo them. It seemed that they had printed his handwritten notes by Mr. Thompson, which included several questions and a section for free responses. It made sense why Nick had to seek our input, given that all responses had to be submitted to Mr. Thompson. We were given a week to think about it, and a meeting was scheduled to compile our ideas. My plan is to let guests enjoy both the old and modern America. Nick began the presentations. Guests would watch a master confectioner at a nearby traditional sweet shop make sweets in front of them. The welcome drink would be premium tea in a bottle. Nick's plan was certainly attractive. After his presentation, Nick called on us to present in the order we were seated. Just as I stood up for my turn. All right, everyone's presentations are done. Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something. Nick interrupted me. There's someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer. He was likely talking about me. I joined the company as a part-timer and was made a full-time employee when I turned 20. That was 20 years ago, so Nick and Mike probably had no chance to know until recently. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. After that, Nick kept creating opportunities to solicit everyone's opinions, purposefully excluding me from speaking. The meeting unexpectedly heated up and went past the scheduled end time. A few people asked to leave, and the discussion continued with the remaining few. Still here? Normally, you'd leave in that situation. Though I had no attachment to the job initially, hearing kind words from customers made me want to make them happier. For someone like me, with nowhere to go, the inn was my home and customer service was my life. I felt pathetic about my current self. I'm leaving. I left the conference room and started shutting down my computer. I noticed an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking no one would listen to what I had to say anyway, I quietly went home. The next day, while preparing the DM as instructed, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. In his haste to stand up, he hit his knee on the desk. He stared at his computer screen, his face pale. "Nick! What's wrong?" Mike, thinking he should be the first to rush over, approached Nick while still wearing his coat. He peered at the screen with Nick. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Who is responsible for this company? Nick, more irritated than ever, asked, and Mike answered without checking. Probably Sam. Sam wasn't there because he was attending a morning training session for new hires. Nick gave up on getting angry and returned his gaze to the screen. They were looking at an email that arrived right after the end of the working day yesterday. Apparently, no one, including me, had checked it before leaving. The email was from a large company that used us for their annual employee trips. The president and executives of that company also frequently used our services personally. President of the company, Mr. Mason himself, had declared that neither he nor his company would ever use our services again. Well, some companies cancel their employee trips or stop using our services due to financial struggles. Let's just move on. Mike kept wiping the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. Knowing why Mike was so agitated, I quietly watched their interaction. Do you know how much revenue we get from that company? We can find other guests to fill the rooms, but we'll lose the banquet costs, gift shop revenue, rental car fees, and more. Moreover, the gifts were supposed to be prepared by the traditional confectionery shop involved in Nick's proposed plan. If it's known that we incurred such a huge loss at this critical time, Nick's position in the company would be jeopardized. Nick took a deep breath, seemingly trying to calm himself. All right, Mike. Go to New York right now and apologize to Mr. Mason. What? You're coming with me, right? I have urgent work to do. I trust you, which is why I'm entrusting this to you. Please. Mike, believing Nick's sincerity, agreed with a determined look on his face, saying, yes. That's Nick for you. Even if Mike went to apologize, Nick would shift all the blame onto him if the client didn't change their mind. Well, it was Mike's fault to begin with, so it served him right. About 3 hours later, Sam answered a call from somewhere and repeatedly apologized, saying, I'm very sorry. Everyone watched to see what was happening. After ending the call, he informed Nick with a weary tone. When Mike arrived at the client's company, he only made things worse, further infuriating Mr. Mason. He was demanding, get his boss here immediately. It was no wonder Sam was exhausted, dealing with such a call right after returning from training. What is that idiot doing? All right, Adam, you're coming with me. If sacrificing Mike didn't work, then I must be next. Normally, I'd want to refuse at all costs, but I saw an opportunity in this situation. If I can be of assistance, I'd be happy to join you. I immediately followed Nick, and we flew to New York. When we introduced ourselves at the reception, it became clear how serious the situation was. As the receptionist personally escorted us to the president's office. Angry voices leaked through the door, making both Nick and me uneasy. Excuse me. I'm Nick, the supervisor. I understand my subordinate has caused you trouble, and I deeply apologize. Nick, with his experience in the corporate world, knew enough to offer an apology before excuses. However, his customer service skills left much to be desired. I sighed as I saw Mike trembling like a small dog in the corner of the room. What kind of training are you giving your subordinates? Mr. Mason glared at Nick with a red face. The intensity of his gaze made even Nick take a step back. Regrettably, I joined this company only 2 years ago and was unaware of Mike's issues. I should have identified his shortcomings sooner. Indeed. I should have realized sooner. No sensible person would come to apologize and then give a lengthy presentation on the drawbacks of not using their in. Nick froze, his mouth slightly open. Suspecting the worst, I picked up the documents that had fallen to the floor. It seemed Mike hastily prepared these documents on the plane, listing the disadvantages. Disadvantage 1, if you change the venue for the company trip, employees might suspect it's for cost-cutting reasons, leading to a negative impression. Reading it aloud half-jokingly, Nick snatched the papers from my hand and checked the contents with a furious expression. Among the stack of documents was a receipt from a nearby convenience store's copy machine. I felt a pang of dread. hoping he hadn't shown the receipt as well. What do you think he said when I asked what kind of nerve he had to do this? I'm very sorry. Faced with the dire situation, Nick must have thought there was nothing left to do but apologize. In a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from him, he uttered words of apology. He said, "I'm a Harvard graduate. I don't believe I said anything wrong." Mike! What have you done? Forgetting his plan to pin the blame on Mike, Nick yelled loudly, even in front of Mr. Mason. "I didn't do anything wrong." "You're still saying that? Look at him." Mike pointed at me with a shaking hand. "I was assigned to headquarters in my 20s and now I'm a section chief. This guy only made it to headquarters at 42. Everything I've done proves I was right. So why are we losing the contract?" Having said his piece, Mike collapsed to the floor. "Of course. You were sent there because you had nowhere else to go." Mike never expected to hear such words from someone he looked down upon. He lunged at me, and Nick hurriedly stepped in to stop him. "Mr. Thompson told me Mike is a quick thinker, and to take good care of him." There's no way he was pushed aside. "Don't make things worse here. He didn't say quick thinker, he said only quick-witted, didn't he?" I don't remember that part." I recalled the many troubles Mike caused when he was a newbie. When Mike was on the front line, his pride was so high that he never apologized to customers. Customer service, especially in our job, doesn't work alone. It brings both good and bad situations. If the front staff or housekeepers made mistakes, or the cleaning company didn't properly clean a room, one had to apologize to the customers regardless of personal fault. Mike, in such situations, would never apologize, insisting he wasn't at fault. This often angered customers, and as the front desk leader, I frequently had to apologize on his behalf. He caused complaints and disrupted operations, which is why he was quickly moved to headquarters. In departments where he didn't interact directly with customers, his quick thinking was beneficial and things went well. But it seemed his flaws were starting to show. Corporate reservations are supposed to be entered into the system by the sales representative. But a quick check yesterday revealed that more than 10 items were missing from the client's reservation. The handover document clearly stated what needed to be prepared. Why didn't you enter it into the system? Why do we have to give them special treatment? Filling rooms near the banquet hall, setting up all the food in advance. Specifying the brand of wine, they're too demanding. No wonder he always angered customers, I thought, feeling a headache coming on. Grouping them in rooms near the banquet hall is for our benefit too. It makes it easier for the staff to set up beds and serve breakfast since everyone's schedule is synchronized. As for the other requests, Mr. Mason suggested them to lighten our load. I didn't know that. Nick finally seemed to realize that Mike was the one who had angered the client. What did you say to them? I just told them we wouldn't give them special treatment anymore. We shouldn't waste effort on things that don't bring in money. I was utterly exasperated at his lack of understanding of customer service. Of course, we shouldn't comply with unreasonable demands. But carrying over successful practices from past stays makes customers feel remembered and enhances their experience. Good memories encourage repeat visits. That's part of our job. I looked down at Mike, who was sitting on the floor. In our job, nothing is a waste. Mr. Thompson likely moved you to the sales department, hoping you'd finally understand this. How do you think he feels now that you've failed to meet his expectations? Mike, tears in his eyes, fled the president's office. I was amazed he still hadn't apologized. You have it tough, Adam. It's okay, we're all employees of the same company. I deeply apologize for this disrespectful incident. Especially after all the care you've shown us. If it weren't for you, Adam, I really would have stopped staying here. When I heard you were moving to the sales department, I was willing to reconsider if you handled it. Seeing us talk so amicably, Nick's face contorted. Do you two know each other? Adam's service is excellent. I always requested him specifically. Normally, we don't accept specific staff requests, but we made an exception for Mr. Mason, adjusting my shifts accordingly. He had personally stayed at our hotel just before my transfer, and during casual conversation, I mentioned, I'm moving to the sales department soon. If I hadn't told him then, things could have been much worse. Please continue to take care of us. I look forward to it. On the return flight, Nick awkwardly offered me a can of beer. It's still working hours. Of course, I had no intention of forgiving him for a single beer. Nick might try to pin everything on Mike and avoid any consequences. While pondering this, a startling fact came to light. Nick, the tea bottles for the plan have arrived. I handed Nick a bottle labeled with our inn's name. They look good. What are you talking about? These are plastic bottles. I had assumed we would use the trendy, high-end bottling tea. But what arrived were ordinary plastic bottles of tea with customized labels. The only unique aspect was the label, which had the inn's name, making it look customized. Upon further investigation, I discovered that a substantial amount of money was set to be paid to the tea company. It was priced like bottling tea. Does this plastic bottle really cost $100 each? The tea inside is specially blended for us. The extra cost is for that. Wouldn't it be better to use another tea company? Or is there a specific reason we must use this one? As Nick continued to make excuses, I showed him a printed email. I informed the tea company's president, Mr. Mitchell, that we discovered irregular payments and he confessed. He said you two were high school classmates and planned to split the extra money. That idiot. Why did he confess? That's not important. You should worry about yourself, this could turn into a police matter. Opening the bottle cap, I suggested. How about calming down with this tea? It supposedly has a relaxing effect. Nick drank the tea frantically. In the following days, decisions were made about their fates. Mike was reassigned to the General Affairs Department, with no chance of transfer or promotion, as per Mr. Thompson's orders. As for Nick, since the payment to the tea company hadn't yet been made, he narrowly avoided legal trouble. Instead, he was encouraged to leave the company, and to avoid further complications, Nick submitted his resignation. Rumor has it that connections between HR departments have made it difficult for him to find new employment. Even though it was good to have those two gone, something unexpected happened in the sales department. Everyone became motivated and united in refining the 50th anniversary plan. In the end, my plan was adopted. We collaborated with the Tourist Information Center to provide personalized guides. The plan, tailored to the number of guests, was truly special for the 50th anniversary. Hey, is Adam's family coming to stay? I immediately booked that special plan for my family. Sam noticed it on the reservation list and quickly picked up on it. Yes, I'm inviting my father. That's great. I might invite my parents too. I lacked the courage to face my father just as Adam. But here, with the confidence Mr. Mason praised, I felt ready. The 50th anniversary plan was a perfect opportunity to reconnect with my father. I hoped to bring back the days when we could laugh together as we once did.